Yes, good afternoon. I think you all know me. I'm George Pyle, editorial page editor, or I guess we call it opinion page editor now because we're not so focused on pages. So I'm the opinion editor of the Salt Lake Tribune. And the rest of you would like to introduce yourselves as well. Lauren? I think you're on.
Yeah. I am, thank you. I'm Lauren Gussis, executive editor of the Tribune, and I see Tim on my screen next. So Tim, I'll hand off to you.
Yeah. And I'm Tim Fitzpatrick, and my title these days is Senior Director of Public Outreach and Operations. It's the longest title I've ever had.
And let's see, Holly.
Sorry. Hi, Senator. We've met. I'm Holly Mullen. I'm on the editorial board, former journalist of many years, and now doing public engagement and communications work for Salt Lake City. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Paul.
Senator, thanks for carving out a few minutes this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul. Good to see you.
That's great. And last but not least, Scott.
Hi, Senator. I'm Scott Anderson, and I'm a community board member.
Excellent. Let me introduce also my chief of staff, Liz Johnson. Liz, will you wave or say hello? Liz just flew in this morning.
Thanks for making time for us. Good to be back with you today.
Okay, great. Thank you. And with that, we can get started. Senator Romney, please kick us off.
Liz, your broadband is obviously inferior. Okay, and well, all right. I'll get going then. First of all, let me just describe, if you will, national priorities, and then some priorities that are more local and perhaps more imminent in terms of their interest here and across the country. Some broad priorities. Number one, obviously, we're very concerned about COVID and helping get the economy back on track. At the same time, we seem to be making good progress. I'm pleased with Jeffrey Zients, who's the director in the White House, who's responsible for the inoculation process. And that seems to be going pretty well in different states. I was happy to visit a inoculation site in Davis County. They're doing almost 3,000 people per day at that site. We seem to have mass inoculation sites doing well here in Utah, and from what we can see around the country. I'm encouraged on that front, but clearly the development of various strains and mutations of the COVID virus are giving people pause here and around the world. Some personal areas of national interest. One is very concerned about the amount of debt we have as a nation and the fact that we keep on adding to it at record rates. The $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill that was passed just recently will add roughly $1.9 trillion to the debt. And now the White House is talking about another $3 trillion infrastructure program. How much of that would be debt financed? We don't know at this stage, but we're adding a lot of debt. And I have a bill called the Trust Act, which is designed to save each of the major trust funds and to ultimately get our budget into balance. And the trust funds are Medicare, Social Security Disability, Social Security Old Age, and the Highway Trust Funds. They would be dealt with a subcommittee on each one of those trust funds, which would be made up of Republicans and Democrats, both from the Senate and the House. And if we can find a bipartisan solution, it would be taken by priority to the floor of each House and to be passed. That is something which is supported by a number of leading Democrats in the Senate and a number of Republicans in the Senate as well. It's also supported by some 60 members of the House, half Republican, half Democrat. So we're making progress there. Obviously a big national concern. The emergence of China is in some respects a real priority for many, many Americans. I being one of them. China intends to replace liberal democracy in the world as the standard for the world with authoritarianism, and they're succeeding. In the last 15 years, freedom around the world has been on the retreat, according to Freedom House, who measures freedom country by country, and China is getting stronger and stronger. I am now the leading Republican on the subcommittee dealing with East Asian policy, and we'll be focusing on the development of a national strategy to deal with the emergence of China economically, militarily, and geopolitically. There's another priority that's important to me, and I think the people in Utah, which is family security. Our population in America is declining. The birth rate is declining, and a lot of families are having a hard time making ends meet. We hear from young people that want to have more children, that they don't know whether they can afford more children. So I've proposed a plan which takes our current programs for families and transfers them instead into a monthly payment, a check of roughly $350 a month for children under 6 years old, $250 a month for kids over 6 years old. This is designed to help provide security to families in America so that families can decide to have as many children as they want, and those kids can also be properly cared for. That's a priority. Another priority relates to the public lands which we have in our state, and a concern that when we have the federal government change hands from time to time, that policy goes from guardrail to guardrail, and we'd like to have more stability in our policy as it relates to public lands. We'd like to be able to manage our forests better. I would, for instance, far prefer to see Utah manage our forests so that we could reduce the amount of fuel which leads to wildfires. At the same time, reduce the amount of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere as a result of those wildfires. Another major national issue, of course, and global issue relates to the warming of the planet. And like many in Utah, I'm concerned about the pollution along the Wasatch Front, but also the CO2 that goes into our environment globally that is leading to climate change. It's affecting us here in Utah and across the country in a very significant way. And I'm looking at a wide array of proposals to see if we can't encourage the development of technologies which would be adopted here and around the world to reduce global emissions. Other issues, immigration. We're seeing a crisis at the border. Part of that is due to an adjustment in policies from the new administration. I think more than just, however, border strategy, we need to look at our legal immigration system and see if we should modernize and update that as well. The minimum wage is a topic which was put on the national agenda just recently by the administration. And I'm working with a small group of Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to come up with a bipartisan proposal with regards to the minimum wage. And then finally, I note just infrastructure. I noted earlier on, the president is planning on putting in place a $3 trillion infrastructure plan. There's a group of, again, Republican and Democrat senators that are proposing our own infrastructure plan. It's not a $3 trillion proposal, by the way. But those are the things that I'm working on. Those are the priorities that are on my desk for the coming year. And as you can tell, it's a pretty full list of things that I'll be working on. But it's consistent, I think, with the things I'm hearing from people across our state, and consistent with I think, the priorities of many people in the Senate, in the House, and in the White House. And with that, I'll turn back to you for questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. That's quite a list. Keep you busy.
Thanks, George.
I think first, and we had expected that you would raise immigration, and I think I'd just like to ask you if maybe we could go into a little bit more detail on what specifically might really get through Congress. I mean, there's been bills that have been passed by the House, but not the Senate. There have been bills that have been passed by the Senate, but not the House. I think we had reason to believe that Democratic or Republican presidents in the past would have signed a bill, an immigration reform bill, if it had ever gotten to them. Can you be specific about what you might hope actually might come out of this Congress, what you might be able to negotiate, as you are kind of standing at the bridge between the Democrats and the Republicans, as you seem to be?
Well, as you know, given the history as it relates to immigration, there has been a great deal of work on this over the years. There have been so-called gangs of 8 and so forth that have been formed that have looked at immigration, have come up with bipartisan proposals, but at the last minute, there were people who objected and it did not become law. And that's because it's a very emotional topic, and in part because it deals with at least 2 very different issues. One is the issue of the border and what goes on at the border and who comes in and who is given asylum status and what do we do with unaccompanied children and what do we do with large numbers of people that want to come across the border. So the border and how we deal with the border is one very important issue. The other issue relates to our legal immigration system and how we deal with people who are applying, let's say, from countries all over the world that want to come here legally. Who gets to come? How many get to come? What will their status be while they're here? And those are two very separate topics, if you will, obviously related. And connected to those two is the question of what do you do with those that are already here that did not come through in a legal process. How do we deal with the so-called dreamers, the children of those that came through the country illegally? How do we deal with the 11 or 12 million others that are here illegally? And so all of those areas are very much in the mix. And when you seem to make progress on one or two areas, you find that the other area ends up being a sticking point. And so, I don't know whether the right approach is going to be to take things apart into their smaller elements and see if we can pass legislation piece by piece, or whether these two different areas will have to be addressed at the same time. But I do know that we have a group of some 20 senators, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats. We meet regularly. We just began this, by the way, in I think it was November of last year. There were only 8 of us in this group, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and it's now expanded to 20. And some people are calling us the G20. And we have decided to take on the minimum wage, as well as immigration and infrastructure as topics we're working on. Whether we come up with something which we can present to the rest of the body, I don't know. But I will note that we recognize that to ultimately solve our immigration challenges, we're going to have to find common ground between Republicans and Democrats. That is a quintessentially American approach, which is the founders of the country insisted that there would be an effort to find consensus and common ground, and that we would reach solutions towards the center, as opposed to having one party get in and impose the views simply of that party. And it makes it more difficult, obviously, when you have to get two parties to agree on something. And I think there's the will to do that at this stage. I hope there is. And I will be part of an effort that looks to get common ground. I note that at the end of last year, the Republicans and the Democrats were unable to come up with a COVID relief package. The Republicans said it should cost $500 billion. The Democrats said it should be $2.2 trillion. And that went on for months and months. And our small group of 8 people came together with a roughly $900 billion proposal, which ultimately formed the basis to get something done. So we've done it before. I hope we can do it again on immigration, but it's probably the toughest topic to take on a bipartisan basis. And nonetheless, I'm cautiously optimistic. Thanks, George.
Senator, I was excited to hear that climate change is on your agenda. We recently did a poll, and climate change and clean air are among the top issues that Utahns want to see Washington address and that they want to see our state address. And you were recently quoted in the Washington Examiner of leaning in, as they said, on a carbon tax to spur clean energy breakthroughs. Where are you on the Baker-Schultz proposal, and how willing are you to push it?
I'm pretty intrigued with the Baker-Schultz proposal. For those not familiar with that, it is a tax that's applied to oil companies and other energy producing entities. And then the revenue that's generated from that tax is sent as a dividend to all the citizens in America, so that they can have additional money to pay for what might be higher gasoline prices or fuel energy prices and so forth. So it's money out of one pocket and into the other, but it is designed to create an incentive for various businesses and producers of various kinds to make products and that are less emitting, less prone to put out CO2 or other greenhouse gases into the environment. It's also designed to encourage the practices in agriculture and in other parts of our economy, which can capture greenhouse gases, whether from the air, whether from a smokestack, or whether just going into the ground. And so my team and I are studying whether the Baker-Schultz approach will actually yield the desired result of innovation and technology. And I'm glad you mentioned it, Scott, because my desire is not just to make things more expensive so people use less of it here in America, because frankly, that won't make any difference. Why do I say that? Miraculously, if every car in America stopped and we drove no cars at all for the next 10 years, greenhouse gases continue to rise on a global basis. So America, what do we do here? If we just change our practices, that doesn't change the global warming that goes on. And so the only way we're going to be able to change the global emissions is if we are able to develop technologies which we adopt here and which are low cost and low emitting, and therefore are adopted by other countries as well, so that the globe reduces its emissions. So I'm looking at the Baker-Schultz plan, not with the eyes of someone who says, oh, let's make things more expensive so we don't use so much energy. That's not what motivates me. What motivates me is, how do we create incentives for the private sector to become lower emitting? Now, I also would note, I'm in favor of making a substantial investment in technology in our universities and in our government energy labs. Again, because I think technology and innovation is going to be the only way we're able to deal with the global issue which we have. And by the way, there's a book by Bill Gates, which he describes a very similar approach, saying that ultimately, everybody driving a Prius doesn't make it work. Even if everybody in the world drove a Prius, we still have CO2 keep going up. By the way, the reason it keeps going up, as you know, is that some countries are going to become much more industrialized than they are today. India, China, Brazil, Indonesia. And as these countries industrialize, we put more and more CO2 in the environment. So technology is really the only approach that I've seen so far that gets us to where we'd like to be. And the Baker-Schultz approach, which is a price on carbon, is one way of getting there. I would note, for instance, that there's a lot of very promising technology in the area of capture from the air of carbon dioxide. Capture it, compress it, pump it back into the earth. And if there were a price on carbon, obviously the people who are developing technology to capture carbon in the air would be able to be compensated for doing so. We already compensate them a little bit, but a carbon tax, carbon dividend would compensate them even more and create perhaps more technology that would help us solve the crisis that we face long term.
So, Senator, how about just the existing technology with regard to renewables? It seems like even without further technological developments, it's underutilized, particularly in Utah. We could have a lot more solar panels. We could have a lot more windmills. Why don't we? Why can't we? We're like one of the biggest coal consumers in the country. What can we do to fast track that?
Well, let me just note that there are sort of two incentives for what you described. One is reducing pollution, particularly along the Wasatch Front, so we don't have as deadly inversions as we've had. And finding ways to do so, in my opinion, makes all the sense in the world. I'm one of those that thinks we should have in place very stringent auto emission standards that we apply to auto manufacturers in the United States and around the world, and that we in Utah ought to insist on the highest level of emission standards in our vehicles, whether that's trucks, automobiles, you name it. And as we talk about, for instance, an inland port, I want to know how many trucks we're bringing in, how many long haulers are going to be going up and down our mountain canyons, and how much diesel fume they're going to be putting into the atmosphere. I mean, these emissions issues, as they relate to the pollution along the Wasatch Front, are critical for us. And so I'm happy to move to encourage the adoption of technologies here that will reduce emissions or pollution on the Wasatch Front. At the same time, if we're thinking about how do we deal with climate change, we got to think a lot broader than just what happens in Utah or clearly what happens in the United States. Because as I've noted, what we do here in the United States, we produce less than 15% of the global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions as a country. We're, I think, roughly 10% now. And China produces far more global emission than we do. And they're adding almost a coal plant a day in China. So saying we're gonna close down a coal power plant here that'll kill a lot of jobs here and raise the cost of electricity here may be good for our pollution on the Wasatch Front. Actually, we don't get our, as you know, we don't have coal plants that affect the pollution on the Wasatch Front. So I shouldn't quite say that. It may reduce emissions from Utah, but it doesn't do anything for the world. And what we're going to have to do is have in place technologies and procedures that get China and the big emitters, China, Brazil, India, get them to adopt technologies that are less emitting, so that we can bring down the greenhouse gases going into the entire planet. So, from my view, Utah, we got to focus on reducing pollution in places where it's a real problem for us, and then we got to have a global strategy which is adopted not just here but around the world.
And the global strategy you put on China and India more than on us.
Well, it's on all of us. So for instance, if you put a price on carbon, we're going to be taxing our oil and gas companies here, and that's going to be a price that we all pay. I take the tax revenue that we receive from that and give it back to people as a dividend, so our families aren't hurt. But it does mean that companies that are using a lot of energy are going to work very hard to develop technologies to use less energy. I mean, right now, I had no idea that manufacturing cement is one of the largest producers of CO2 in the world. And having American companies that manufacture cement find ways to do so in a less emitting way is really important. I spoke with the chief executive of Nucor Steel. Nucor, as you know, is a major employer in Utah with about 1,200 people that work at Nucor. They're the largest steel company in the United States. He explained to me that Nucor continues to invest in ways to produce steel with lower and lower emissions. And the amount of emissions that come from steel, a ton of steel at Nucor, are one quarter or 1/6 as much that comes from a ton of steel produced by China. So we got to get the world to get with it and to adopt some of these technologies. And that may mean a border policy. Part of the Baker-Schultz approach is a border adjustment tax, saying if you're bringing in product from overseas that's a major emission product, that we're going to have to adjust that price so that we accommodate the difference in all the emissions you're putting in the global environment.
Senator, I'd like to ask a question of a reader, if I may, now switching gears. He writes, I'm a high school teacher at one of the largest high schools in Utah. Every day I worry about a mass shooting happening at my school. I don't feel safe for myself, my students, or my family around the state. What is your plan to reduce mass shootings, and how can you ensure it becomes legislation?
When I ran for office in Utah, as you know well, I was asked time and again what my view was with regards to the Second Amendment and gun rights in our state. And I made a commitment to the people. It had two parts. One, I said I was open to the improvement of technology with regards to our current background check system. There had been recently, as you may recall, a person who had been dishonorably discharged from the military, who had been able nonetheless to get a weapon and to use that to kill others. And I believed that it was appropriate for us to update that background check technology so that could not happen again. And I am open to working with a number of the pieces of legislation and legislators that are looking at background check technology modernization. At the same time, I said I was not going to vote for new gun legislation, new federal gun legislation, that states are open to adopt legislation as they feel appropriate, but that the federal government should not tell Alaskans that what they do relative to what New Yorkers are going to be told what they do. And so I made that commitment when I ran for office, and I intend to honor that commitment. I know it's unusual for a politician to honor the promises they made during the campaign, but I say that tongue in cheek, but I do intend to honor that promise. So I will not be voting for new federal legislation relating to guns, and leave to the legislature of Utah, closest to our people, any decisions they have in that regard.
Senator, I have a question about the national monuments in Utah. I know that the delegation has expressed that that this should be settled legislatively rather than by executive order. And so I'm just wondering what sort of legislative solution you would be supportive of, and if you would be willing to consider expanding or enlarging or restoring some of the cuts, at least, even if you wouldn't be supportive of going all the way.
Yes, thank you. Very good question. And for those not familiar with the topic in great detail, under the Antiquities Act, the president can designate the boundaries of a monument and then restrict the activities that go on in that territory in order to protect the antiquities. The original Antiquities Act, passed 100 years ago, said that the president was to use as little land as he possibly could to protect those antiquities. And that was its purpose. It was not a conservation law or a recreation law. It was to protect antiquities. And so in terms of history, President Obama, President Clinton designated large portions of Utah, in each case well over 1 million acres, with Bears Ears and Grand Staircase as national monuments. President Trump came along and said, no, I'm going to cut those by a substantial amount, by maybe 80%, and go back just to the antiquities themselves that were being protected. And so you have a setting where, because the president can preserve these antiquities, him or herself, you may have a change in boundaries and a change in what's authorized in a particular area based upon who's president. And we could go from one policy to another over the years, and that just seems like a less than ideal approach. And so those of us in the delegation, including, by the way, the governor, lieutenant governor, and leaders here in Utah, as well as the delegation in Washington, have said to the administration and to the new Secretary of Interior, who I just recently spoke with about this, and I spoke, by the way, with a representative of the White House just last week on this topic. Wouldn't we be better to have legislators and the White House work together to define the boundaries, to decide exactly what's going to be done in which part of what is the former national monument area? We could, if we do it that way, we could perhaps include in the legislation a visitor center, a cultural center. We could provide for rangers to be responsible for police in the area, guides to help people understand what they're seeing, and then you wouldn't have it flip from being a monument to not being a monument, depending on who's president. Would make some sense to have some permanence. And I would note, in any kind of discussion or negotiation like that, I, for one, and I'm sure it's true of the other members of the delegation as well, would be open to expanding the national monument boundaries as they exist today, and going much larger. Let's look at what's needed. And there might be different categories of areas. Some areas where you'd say, we're going to allow hunting and fishing here. Other areas you might say that we're going to allow grazing happening here. Other areas it would be, well, we're not going to allow any activity in this area because this is where some of the artifacts that are to be preserved are located. Those boundary discussions, I've encouraged the White House to consider giving us a deadline and saying, hey, you guys all come together, negotiate boundaries and land use, if you will, land management, depending upon those areas, and come up with something. And if you get that done by a certain time frame, fine. If not, why, we're just going to designate it a monument again. But I would hope that we can get to a permanent solution that would give, particularly our Native American friends, there's a Bears Ears tribal coalition that we met with in a Zoom call just last week. The entire delegation met with them. We laid out this concern. I think everybody's concerned about this idea that we go from one monument designation under one president to a different one under the next, and we'd like to get some permanence.
Senator, I have another question for you. You know, as we look at the Republican Party, and as we do polling here in Utah, the number of Republicans, especially among the millennial crowd, are disappearing. They're becoming unaffiliated. And what are the core principles that you think should bring the younger generation into the Republican Party so that it remains a viable party?
Well, I believe that the principles of my party are the best designed to help people have a better life. And those policies from time to time have to adjust to take into account what's going on in the world. But in my view, Republican policies are better for building a strong economy and therefore building more good businesses and therefore creating more good jobs and raising wages. We are the party that should be making it very clear we want to see higher wages for the American worker. And the best way to get that done is by adopting conservative policies. That's my view. And we can convince young people of that. That'd be very helpful. I think number two, we have to make it very clear we want to see equal opportunity in our country. We want people of all backgrounds to have the opportunity to go to a great school, to pursue either college education or technical education, and be able to realize their potential and to fulfill their dreams. Number three, I think we have to let people know that we're a family party, that we want to help those that want to form families and have children. That's why my Family Security Act, which I've described, I think is something which is important to communicate to young people. And then let me note that I think we've been behind the times when it comes to dealing with climate. I think young people recognize that climate change represents a real threat to Utah and to the planet at large. And I think we've had some, well, I'll say at best, mixed messages, in many cases, worse messages, where some Republicans say, oh, it's just a hoax and so forth. I don't think that flies with young people. And so I think our approach, which is designed to actually reduce global emissions, not just to say, okay, I'm going to make it harder for an American business. I'm going to instead say, how do we get global emissions down? That's something I think we have to adopt as a party if we're going to see ourselves be able to draw millennials into our party as we have in the past, and young people. And of course, there are a number of other issues as well. But I would just note that I think young people are idealistic, and that's something that's wonderful about young people and something I aspire to be myself. And they want to see people who are respectful of others, who welcome others that may be different, either ethnically or religiously or gender-wise or LGBTQ. And we have to be a party which is accepting of people for differences. And that, I think, is something we also have to work on. And I do believe as well that the Republican has long believed that the character and the kinds of principles that have formed the basis of our country from its beginning are principles that we look for in our elected leaders and those that we choose to help guide our party. And I hope that that's something we're able to provide to the American people as we go forward. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And that's a big question, and one which I think my party is grappling with. And I mean, both parties, I'm sure, are grappling with that. How do we attract the young people? And by the way, and how do we attract more minorities? We don't do very well with African Americans or people of Hispanic descent, and we got to do a lot better. And so we've got some work to do.
As a follow-up, are you willing to be a standard bearer for that party? I mean, obviously you were the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, and it seems like the party needs a new standard bearer that represents those type of principles. Our polls show that you can be reelected as long as you want, and maybe that's part of the question too. Are you willing to continue to run for office and be reelected?
Well, I'm getting a little long of tooth, as you know, Scott. I'm older than you are, So, but I know we have a current president who's even older than I am. But I'm not going to be running for president again. I loved the experience. It was fantastic meeting people around the country, and a number of folks I met have become wonderful friends. And I'm more optimistic about America as I've seen people across the country. But I think my party is best by having a new face than someone who is already defined in people's minds, sometimes positively, sometimes not as positively. And so I think a new person has a better shot. I don't know who that will be. My guess is, assuming President Trump doesn't run again, we may have, I don't know, 15 or 16 people who decide to run for president again. And so I enjoy the job I've got. I enjoy being our senator, and enjoy being able to get around the state and hear what's on people's minds. There are a lot of concerns that we have across the state right now, and I'm doing my very best to promote Utah's interests and the interests of our great country.
Well, I mean, you mentioned attracting minorities and attracting more people to the big Republican tent. But what's in the news right now is, say, what's going on in Georgia, where the Republican Party has basically decided there's no way that we're going to get African Americans to vote for us, so we're going to make it harder for them to vote. I mean, it's pretty blatant. And so I'm sure you read all this unsolicited advice you get all the time, which is that, you didn't leave the Republican Party left you. And is it even worth saving? Is it gone? And does it stand for anything other than tax cuts for the rich and owning the libs? And I remember you came and talked to us once before, and you said once Donald Trump is out of the picture, whether it's by impeachment, resignation, losing re-election, or being term limited, when he's out of the picture, we have some hope of going back to familiar times when Republicans and Democrats weren't that far apart. And the argument was, well, should the corporate tax rate be 23 or 27? And you argued about that. Donald Trump's not in office, but it doesn't seem like he's going away. It still seems like a lot of the things he stands for are so popular in the party that some of your fellow Republicans aren't willing to challenge them.
Well, I'll begin by just talking about Georgia, if you will, and that is that any effort to suppress people from voting, whether minorities or otherwise, is a terrible idea, and would spell the ultimate doom of a political party, mine or anyone else that tried such a move, because that's ultimately, long term, that's going to fail. And I'm not terribly familiar with the Georgia legislation. I do read the articles about it. And I hear the people in Georgia describing it differently than is characterized by some. And I'll become more familiar with the Georgia legislation as time goes on. There is, again, a small group of us that are looking at seeing whether we need to have federal legislation of some kind to bring more trust into our election system. And you recognize this. It may well be that trust in the American election system is at an all-time low. And on the right, that's obviously related to President Trump, who's convinced, from what I can see in the polls, a majority of Republicans to believe that the last election was stolen, that it was fraudulent, and people on the left are convinced in the same way that voter suppression is keeping people from voting, and there's just a lot of distrust in our elective system, and so. If there's a way of restoring some trust through legislation, that's something which this small group and I are looking at. That's not an easy topic to take on, but I'm very much opposed to efforts to effectively suppress votes. Now, by the way, the 1965 Voter Rights Act said that you cannot either explicitly or just effectively discriminate against or prejudice a group of people from voting. And so if some state legislature somewhere does something which has the effect of making it harder for a particular minority group to vote, that should be struck down under the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that law, I mean, current federal law should prevent the kinds of voter suppression that is being bandied about by some people. But if for some reason current legislation looks like it's inadequate to restore trust in our voting system, that's something I'll be working on. With regards to my party and where it goes post Donald Trump. Well, first, we're not sure it's really post Donald Trump. He wants to continue to play a major role, as you know, and he may even run again. And of those that are thinking of running for president, most of them are drawing on the populist wave that exists in my party. And by the way, I note that there's a bit of that on the other side as well, which is there's a populist wave in the Democratic Party, which is our problems as a nation are due to the big banks and the rich people. And that's what you hear on the left. And so populism is a growing feature on the left and on the right, and by the way, globally, whether in Hungary or Poland, France, Peru, Brazil. Populism, it seems that once it takes root politically, it doesn't go away, and it's going to continue to be a thread in both parties. And I'd note it's one of the reasons why I think it's important that we maintain the protection of the minority that has existed in our federal government from the founding. From the founding in this, and it's only in one body. Everything is decided by majority in Washington, except in one body. The Supreme Court decisions are by the majority. In the House of Representatives, it's by the majority. The president's selected by the majority of electors. But in the Senate, it's not the majority. You have to have 60 votes. Right now, you need 10 Republicans, as well as the 50 Democrats to pass a bill. And that allows the minority to have some sway. And that means legislation moves towards the center. If instead you make the Senate like all those others, majority only, why, you're going to move towards populist extremes, whether it's Republican in charge or Democrat in charge. And that would be a course which I think could be very dangerous to the institution of our federal government. So, yeah, populism is probably not going to disappear. I hope we have a nominee in 2024 who believes in standing up against authoritarianism, who calls Putin and Kim Jong-il bad guys, if you will, who believes that character really does matter in elected officials, who believes that trade with other nations on a fair basis is a good thing for America, and who believes in being involved in affairs in the world, not because we just care about what's happening to all these other people, but because it's good for America. We're involved in the world and have been because that makes things better for us, makes us more prosperous and less likely to get dragged into wars. So I hope those are the principles that define my party down the road. But as Scott Anderson raised in his question, it's not a sure thing, but that's the kind of people that I'll be working to see become our nominee.
So you're not in favor of doing away with the filibuster?
No, the filibuster, I think, is a term which most people kind of scratch their head and say, you mean you want a bunch of old people standing around talking for hours? And actually, it's really the 60 vote rule. It means that something to pass the Senate has to have 60 votes. If you eliminate that 60 vote rule, why legislation going forward is going to no longer be crafted by two parties looking for common ground. By the way, I believe that creates better legislation, better laws. Instead, it's just going to be one party. And the one party is going to, of course, appeal to their base. And that means legislation is going to be coming from the extremes, whether from the Democratic Party, their extremes, or from our party. So for the last 4 years, our party was in charge, and the Democrats carried out the filibuster over 200 times. And because they believed that what my party wanted was too extreme, and so they exercised that 60 vote rule, I think, over 200 times. Now they're in charge. They say, well, let's get rid of that 60 vote rule. It's like, well, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And beyond that, let's see if we can't find common ground to work things out together. And we've been successful. So for instance, we passed two major COVID relief bills with Republicans and Democrats coming together. A $4 trillion rescue, 2 packages, totaling $4 trillion. We did that on a bipartisan basis. We passed a new military authorization program on a bipartisan basis. We do that all the time. I think it's a better way to go.
So just continuing on that theme, just one more follow-up. I know we've beaten this one pretty hard, but with Rush's passing, who I would argue was the most influential person in the party, with Fox News ratings down, with Trump's Twitter account suspended more or less. First, is compromise a term that Republicans will accept and embrace and no longer be afraid of it being termed with as a rhino? And second, as you look at the balance of this congressional term, history tells us that most congressional terms can handle one major piece of legislation. And with the COVID bill being, you can argue whether or not that was an emergency resolution or more of a strategic ploy by the Democrats. You talked a lot about everything from healthcare to global warming, obviously tax reform, entitlements. Are there any of those specific topics that there is appetite for a bipartisan resolution where there may be some movement on a large piece of legislation, or are we still a ways from really working on a bipartisan standpoint in Congress?
Well, what's interesting, as you raise that, Paul, which is that the term compromise is kind of a dirty word for the base of either party. The Democrats, the progressives are saying, don't compromise with those Republicans. Republicans say, don't compromise with those Democrats. But then if you change the word to, do you think we should find common ground and work across the aisle? That's very popular. So we have to choose the word that's more acceptable to our respective voters. But look, America is the most powerful nation on earth and the leader of the free world, in part because of the institutions we put in place, and that includes our federal government and our United States Senate, and we work by finding common ground, and whether you call it compromise or common ground or working across the aisle, that has to be the way we go forward if we intend to remain the great nation that we are. So I think that just goes as an essential element of our future. In terms of legislation that we might be able to work on successfully going forward, I think the willingness of the Democratic Party to adopt the reconciliation process in such an aggressive way has, if you will, created a great deal of energy and momentum to working together. That was perhaps the positive side of it. There's a negative side to their use of the reconciliation. As you probably know, under the rules of the Senate, spending and taxing can be done with only 51 votes. So spending bills or tax policy can be done by the Democrats alone right now. Other legislation requires 60 votes. But, and they call this 51 vote rule the reconciliation. So anything that's taxing or spending can be done with 51 votes. And President Biden has already used that once. During President Trump's 4 years, he only used it once. But the Democrats are talking about using it again very soon for another $3 trillion in spending. And I read an article this morning that Senator Schumer is being advised he could use it yet again. And so if they keep on using this 51 vote rule called reconciliation, why, it's going to create a lot of, I think, anxiety and desire on the part of Republicans and Democrats to say, hey, can't we do a better job by working together? So I think we will see a minimum. I hope we'll see a minimum wage bill proposed that's bipartisan. I think immigration is a bigger stretch. But we'll see. I think the administration itself is going to take on some policies. Look, on immigration, President Trump put in place a couple of policies that really, if you will, didn't solve the border problem, but ameliorated it. And that was, he said, look, if you want to apply for asylum, you got to do it in your home country. and if your home country isn't safe, in the country next door to you. And if you come to our border, you got to wait in Mexico before you come through. And those policies really slowed down the border problem. And those have been reversed by this administration. And you've, of course, got a crisis that you're seeing there now. I think you're probably going to see an infrastructure bill, but I hope it's a bipartisan infrastructure bill, but it may end up being another bill passed through 51 votes, reconciliation. So I think you're going to see quite a bit coming in this Congress.
Senator, I've got a question, unrelated, but I'll pivot back to proposed legislation that you've mentioned a couple of times, which is your own in support of parents and families.
Yeah.
A few readers are interested in your position on the Violence Against Women Act that was recently passed in the House. And if and when it comes to the Senate, where would you land on it?
I have not seen the act and studied it, and so I would have to do that before I could really comment on the act. Obviously, I think like every sane person, every thinking person, they want to do everything in their power, and I want to do everything in my power to reduce violence against women, violence against minorities, violence against Asians. This is mind-numbing to me. I hope people begin to recognize that Asian Americans didn't bring COVID here. All right, number one. Number two, Asian Americans contribute well more than their fair share, their per person share to our economy. Many of our more successful enterprises that compete globally and create millions of jobs were founded by Asian Americans. So it just makes absolutely no sense at all. And as you know, I was one of those, along with a number of my grandchildren, who marched in Black Lives Matter protests to communicate the outrage which I feel when our justice system is not fairly applied to people of color. So violence against women would be one more area that I would have great interest in studying, but I can't comment on the particular legislation in the House until I see it. I would note that many times legislators put little poison pills in legislation so that they can get the opposition party to vote no, and then say, see, they're against this good stuff, but they don't realize they put some things in there that are really harmful. So I need to take a look and see what's in the bill. But if there's a need for legislation that would make a difference in reducing violence against women, then I would be very much in favor of that.
Great, thank you. One more from readers. A lot of folks, and we haven't touched on this topic very much over the course of the last 55 minutes or so, interested in how you might help to further reduce healthcare costs for them.
Well, the good news is that there are things we can do that will make a difference. Not a huge difference, but a difference. So we just passed last year, on a bipartisan basis, by the way, a bill that ends surprise billing. And for those that know what that is, it's like, thank heavens. But let's say you have an emergency of some kind and you go to a hospital and you get treated. It turns out that some of the physicians that worked on you were not in your approved network, your insurance approved network. And so you get a bill from those physicians. That's known as a surprise bill. And we stopped that. We said, your insurance company is responsible for those out of network charges where you couldn't do anything about it. It was an emergency, or perhaps it was an anesthesiologist. You were at a hospital that was in system. You had a surgeon in system, but the anesthesiologist was out of system. So we adjusted, we changed that, and that will bring down surprise billings and bring down medical costs. We could do the same thing with regards to prescription drugs. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who at the time was chairman of the Finance Committee, has proposed, if you will, limits on prices on prescription drugs. President Trump did something I agreed with. He said we shouldn't be charging higher prices for prescription drugs here in the United States than is charged by other countries that honor our patents. We shouldn't be charging more than Canada, and limited, therefore, the prices that were charged. So that's an area. I think prescription drug pricing is an area where we can make a real difference for the American people. Long term, one of our challenges is just the way our insurance system works, which is once you get past your deductible, once your expenses are greater than your deductible, from then on, it's entirely free. So you have little incentive to shop around if you're going to have open heart surgery or hip replacement, because you're going to be blowing through your deductible and then it's all free. And so you don't shop around to see what the prices are of different hospitals. That could be changed by using a system more like that, which is used in France and Switzerland. I hope that we're able to look at those kinds of options and see if they could make a difference here. Health savings accounts are also a terrific way to reduce the cost of medicine in our country. And they are being adopted more and more by American people. That I'd like to see people be able to put more money into their health savings account. And I'd like them to be able to use their health savings account for more procedures than it is limited to today. All those things will help. And there's effort on all those fronts. I don't know how soon help will be coming, but I think on prescription drugs, we got a good shot at getting that done sometime in the next year or two.
Great, thank you. We are almost at time. I'll check and see if anyone has one final question that was really important to them. And if we've exhausted our mission critical questions, we'd say thank you and defer to you if there's anything else that's on your radar that you feel we didn't get to.
Well, thank you. I just will say I appreciate the chance to speak with you. I appreciate the voice that you have in our community. I think one of the reasons that we have become more polarized politically and more divided nationally is because we're not getting news from sources where there are editors and where there are people who do their best to get the facts right, and who, if they make a mistake, acknowledge they made a mistake and put in place a correction. Many people are receiving their news from the internet, from social media, and perhaps it's curated electronically to show them things they already agree with. And it has led to the belief in various conspiracies and strange theories that are not based in fact and have not been researched. It's interesting. People are prone not to always trust a media source where there are editors and fact checkers as much as they trust some person on the internet who they don't even know who they are. There's no editor. Any person can write, and they say, "Oh, I trust that person more." It's like, you think about that, folks, and use our minds.
We think about that a lot.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'll add this, which is, President Trump continues to say that the election was stolen. I note he said that on the day of the election. He said it the next day. Where did he get the idea that it was stolen? Where's the evidence of that? It wasn't the FBI, because they came out and said they evaluated it and did not find any evidence of broad spread fraud. It wasn't to the intelligence community. It wasn't the CIA or the NSA. They didn't find anything of that nature. So what source did he have for this? It wasn't the secretaries of state or the governors. Even the Republican secretaries of state and Republican governors, they said it wasn't there. So I think people have enough in their own brain to realize, hey, the president's just making it up because he does not have evidence of widespread fraud, or he would show it to us. And so I look at this and say, we have to, given the number of sources of information we have at our fingertips today, we've got to think critically and say, does that make sense? Where would that have come from? And in my opinion, we also have to make sure and get journals that we look at where there are editors and where there are fact checkers and where corrections are made. So I appreciate the work of the Tribune and other journals in our state and across the country, and believe you play a critical role in informing the public and allowing us to maintain the confidence in our election system and in our democracy that it requires. So thank you to all of you.
I appreciate that. I mean, you're kind of strange, though. You obviously read books. You have a lot of books behind you. I've been spending the last hour looking at your bookshelf. Looks like you have 2 copies of the same book by Thomas Jefferson, one on your left and one on your right. So
filling that bookcase,
Yeah.
making it look like I read more than I do.
So okay. No, you don't have to have read them. You have them. That's better than most people. Better than certain ex-presidents I could mention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Good to
On
be
that,
with you.
thank you.
Thank you,
Have a
sir.
great day.
Bye.
We appreciate it.
Senator.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.